set? Okay, let's begin. I want to start by welcoming everybody to Hudson. I hope everybody had a good Thanksgiving holiday. And I think we're very pleased and honored to hold this important event on U.S. policy towards China, particularly focus on nuclear weapons and nuclear arms control, nuclear energy, and then nuclear security. I'm going to introduce each presenter as they speak, and then we'll have hopefully substantial time for questions and comments from the floor. So you might want to start thinking about those as you hear the speakers. If everyone could make sure to turn off your communication devices or turn them silent, that would make the proceedings flow much easier. And I'm Richard Weitz. I'm the director here of the Center for Political Military Analysis and a senior fellow. Hudson's been honored to be doing some events on nuclear issues broadly, supported by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. And this is not part of that series, but it's also a project supported by the foundation. So I think then, do you want to go to the podium? The first speaker will be Professor Nancy Gallagher, who's the director of the Center for International and Security Studies at Maryland. And she's a research professor at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Her current research includes a book project on strategic logics for arms control, public opinion surveys about U.S. security policy and in other countries, initiatives to improve cybersecurity decision-making, and cooperative strategies to reduce nuclear risk and enhance space security. Before coming to the University of Maryland, she was an executive director of the Clinton administration's Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Task Force. She has many publications, the most recent book, Politics of Verification, and she was the editor of Arms Control, New Approaches to Theory and Policy.
Great, thank you. And thank you for having us here today. So the event is looking at U.S. nuclear policy towards China. And obviously, U.S. nuclear policy towards China is a subset of its larger policy towards China. And the Obama administration framed its policy in terms of saying that China was a rising power, but whether that was a good thing or a bad thing for the United States and the rest of the world depended in part on how China chose to use that power. And in effect, the Obama administration called on China to provide the United States and the rest of the world with reassurance that it was going to use its increasing economic, political, and military capabilities in a way that was mutually beneficial, not detrimental to the rest of the world. The Trump administration has framed its policy very differently, both towards China and towards Russia, and frames it as a return to great power competition. And it's a conception of competition between the great powers that really is zero-sum. So any advance for China is considered by definition something that's detrimental to the United States and its allies and its interests around the world. The Trump administration's nuclear posture review treated Russia and China as equally threatening from a nuclear perspective, despite the fact that China's nuclear arsenal is much smaller than Russia's nuclear arsenal. It emphasized that both countries were modernizing their nuclear forces. It asserted that both countries might be planning to use nuclear weapons first as part of an escalate to de-escalate strategy. And it also noted that both countries were developing other advanced non-nuclear strategic capabilities, particularly space, cyber, and artificial intelligence, and that in some of these areas they might actually be ahead of the United States. And they argued that they were actively using all of these capabilities to try to gain strategic advantages over the United States without having it actually spill over into a great power war. The Trump administration's nuclear posture review did not actively rule out arms control, but it was also clear from other things that the Trump administration has done that it's not particularly interested in arms control either. It's withdrawn from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and it has taken no actions towards extending the New START treaty before its 2021 expiration date, despite the fact that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference is coming up in just a few months. And what the United States and Russia in particular, but all of the nuclear weapon states, including China, have done on arms control will be an important factor at that review conference. The Trump administration's position on arms control has essentially been that nuclear arms control with Russia is not in the United States' interest unless China participates too, and that China is just not interested in arms control. There's really no point in even talking to China about joining the INF Treaty or New START or any other form of China because any other form of arms control because China doesn't see that as in its security interests. And this idea that China is just not interested in arms control was actually shared by many officials and analysts associated with the Obama administration as well. So the project, my part of the project that Richard referred to, the MacArthur-funded project, was really looking at this question of, is it true that China's just not interested in arms control, broadly defined? And I would say that it is true that right now, China has no interest in joining New START or INF, both treaties that were negotiated by other countries under very different circumstances that don't speak to China's security concerns at all. But it's not true that China isn't interested in arms control broadly defined. And here, I think it's really important to differentiate between what people often mean when they talk about arms control as formal, legally binding treaties that constrain capabilities, right, to the much broader definition that I use in the work that I do, which is that arms control encompasses any cooperative measures between potential adversaries designed to change capabilities, behavior, or perceptions in ways that reduce the risk of war, the level of destruction should war occur, the costs of military preparations, and the role that threats and use of force play in international relations. And if you take that broad definition of arms control, then I would say that China is interested in arms control. They just think about it very differently than the United States has traditionally done. And that's not a surprise because Chinese officials and academics and experts also think very differently about international relations, about security, about nuclear deterrence. So it's no surprise that they would have different ideas about what types of cooperative measures could help reduce the various types of nuclear risks that they face. Now, China is the most restrained, has the most restrained nuclear posture of any of the declared nuclear weapon states, which I see as making a major contribution to global nuclear risk reduction, even though it's not through formal, legally binding arms control. And in effect, what China would most like to see is the other nuclear weapon states emulating its nuclear posture. China has, from the very beginning of its nuclear weapons development, China has made it clear that it has nuclear weapons only for retaliatory deterrence of nuclear attack. Right? That's the sole purpose. That they will have only the number of nuclear weapons that they need for that purpose, which is currently about 300 total nuclear weapons, about 80 of which are able to reach the United States. That none of those weapons are actively deployed. Right? The warheads are stored separately from the delivery systems. And China has an unconditional no first nuclear use policy. So if you look at all of those choices that China has made, its nuclear posture already is highly restrained. In terms of Chinese attitudes on non-proliferation, I think it's important to remember that China was initially the primary target of early non-proliferation efforts. Right? So it understands non-proliferation, both from the standpoint of the country that other countries are worried about and are discussing a variety of measures up to, and in China's case, including preventive nuclear attack to keep that country from getting nuclear weapons. It also understands it from the standpoint of a country that has nuclear weapons and would prefer that its neighbors not. One of the things that I think is important that China's taken away from that history is the sense that it became much more interested and willing to participate in the global non-proliferation regime after other countries started engaging with it. So we frequently, sort of look down on China or say that its argument that engagement with North Korea will work better than threats and sanctions, that's just a self-interested stance on the part of China, because China wants to continue to trade with North Korea, or China doesn't want a collapse of North Korea because, in effect, it would be on the front line of refugee flows. But from its own history, I think it has good reason for believing that engagement will work better in changing attitudes towards arms control and non-proliferation. China did not initially join the NPT, but it did in the early 1990s. And its decision to join the NPT in the early 1990s, I think, is a key indicator of what it would take to get China to participate in other major arms control agreements. At that point in time, the United States and first the Soviet Union, then Russia, had started agreeing to arms control agreements that were reducing their own nuclear capabilities. So it looked like nuclear weapons were going to be less salient in international affairs than they had been before. It looked like those countries were moving towards, in effect, a more restrained nuclear posture, more like the posture that China had. And it also looked like multilateral diplomacy was going to be more important than military capabilities in the future of global security. So when China looked at all of those things, it made a set of calculations that it wanted to be an active player too. It joined the NPT, it signed the Chemical Weapons Convention, and it joined the CTBT, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty negotiations from early on. And the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, in addition to being something that's near and dear to my heart because of my own personal history, I think is a really good indicator that China will accept legally binding constraints on its own nuclear capabilities when it avers that it's in its security interest to do so. And China was the country that I would say made the biggest compromises in terms of what it was giving up by agreeing not to test again. Of any of the countries that were involved in that negotiations. China made that decision, again, because it calculated that in the post-Cold War world, it had all the nuclear capability it was going to need. Right? Nuclear weapons were going to become increasingly less important. Multilateral diplomacy was going to be more important. It didn't need to continue testing to develop new types of nuclear weapons. The Bush administration, though, came in and essentially took a set of decisions about U.S. nuclear policy and U.S. security policy that invalidated each of those assumptions that the Chinese made when they joined the Test Ban Treaty, in terms of making unilateral decisions about the use of force rather than following basically the, only in self-defense or with Security Council approval, changing its nuclear policy from one that had deterrence as the driving principle to one that had coercive prevention as the driving principle, which suggested that the United States might be willing to use nuclear weapons first under a wider array of circumstances than it had before. And then moving towards deploying a comprehensive global missile defense system, withdrawing from the ABM treaty and making a major effort to build up missile defense, all of which called into question China's judgment that it didn't need new types of nuclear weapons, that it didn't need to test anymore. Nevertheless, they have stayed with the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Right? Neither China nor the United States have ratified that treaty yet, but they've both continued to observe the moratorium on it. Within the Obama administration, the emphasis was less on formal arms control with China because that was considered premature. They were focused primarily on the arms control agreements with Russia, more on strategic dialogue. But that strategic stability dialogue never really got off the ground
because the United States and China were operating from such different first principles. And here in particular, the Chinese kept saying, if you really want strategic stability, make a no first use pledge, right? Or at least acknowledge that you're in a situation of mutual vulnerability with us. And the Obama administration, for a combination, I would say, of not believing that China really took its no first use pledge seriously and being concerned about domestic and alliance politics, not only wouldn't take seriously China's desire for the strategic stability talks to be premised on, the seriousness of their commitment to no first use, they wouldn't admit or acknowledge mutual vulnerability either. But there was some progress kind of below the surface on a number of different nuclear and non-nuclear cooperative measures. There was a resumption of work that had been begun during the Clinton administration on, basically preventing dangerous incidents, on crisis management, on cooperative threat reduction. All of those kinds of things had been gradually gaining steam during the Clinton administration and then basically came to a halt, partly because every time there's a major military incident, one side or the other calls them off, but also because of congressional constraints on our ability to talk with China and to engage in a number of different types of cooperative activities. There was also a dialogue on space. So, the sort of main non-strategic area where the United States was particularly interested in seeing whether or not China was willing to agree to some types of reassurance. And the thing that the Obama administration most wanted from China there, I would say, was an agreement not to use debris-generating anti-satellite weapons. And China, for a long time, in effect, said, well, we'll talk about that in the context of a larger agreement that also constrains weapons in space, and for China, that's particularly space-based missile defense. But it was clear that through the process of engagement and through the series of meetings that they had around this issue, little by little, the Chinese counterparts to the American side did come to recognize that as China became more dependent on space, it was also more threatened by space debris. And they became more open to the idea of actually making a reciprocal pledge not to use debris-generating ASAT weapons. Unfortunately, as we've seen, with China and a number of other countries, right, they don't operate on the same time schedule that the United States does. It takes them time to decide whether or not they actually want to agree to something. They were not ready to make this pledge at the end of the Obama administration. They were prepared to discuss it seriously early in the Trump administration. But by that time, the Trump administration wasn't interested in having those conversations. So the idea that China is just not interested in arms control is, I would say, at least as much a reflection both of our own narrow definition of what kind of arms control we're interested in with China, and our unwillingness to take seriously some of the things that China considers to be important nuclear risk reduction measures. But behind the scenes, I think there still are some important areas of cooperation, and I'm going to turn that over to my other fellow panelists to discuss.
Okay, thank you. Our next speaker will be Ambassador Laura Holgate, who's been a helpfully frequent guest at Hudson events in this nuclear series. She is currently Vice President for Materials Risk Management at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, responsible for designing and executing activities to prevent nuclear terrorism and promoting cooperation between the United States and key partners on nuclear and radiological security and to strengthen the global nuclear security architecture. She designed and launched the Gender Champions for Nuclear Policy Initiative. Previously, from July 2016 to January 2017, she was U.S. representative to the Vienna office of the United Nations and the International Atomic Energy Agency. Before that, she was Special Assistant to the President, Senior Director for Weapons of Mass Destruction, Terrorism, and Threat Reduction on the National Security Council, and earlier on, Vice President for Russia, New Independent States at NCI, directed the DOE's Office of Fissile Material Disposition, and worked on the non-Lugar initiative, getting that making progress in that initiative. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks to Nancy and Jonas for including me in this morning or this afternoon's conversation. So my charge on this panel is to talk about U.S.-China cooperation on nuclear security. And so I'd like to kind of hit three main topics. One is to talk about the history of U.S.-Chinese nuclear cooperation, including China's interesting role in the nuclear security summits. Secondly, to describe the origins of the official U.S.-China nuclear security dialogue and the track 2 engagement, oh my, that is convened between the Nuclear Threat Initiative and the China Arms Control and Disarmament Association. And then finally to mention a few areas where China, both with and without the United States, could do more to support nuclear security. But first, a few basics about China nuclear security. In terms of their weapons arsenal, it's about 290 nuclear weapons. Its stockpile of weapons materials is estimated to include plus or minus 14 tons of highly enriched uranium and plus or minus 3 tons of weapons-grade plutonium. And I would just want to point out, these are orders of magnitude lower than the holdings of US, Russia, UK, France, and even China's civilian fissile material holdings. China has not declared officially that it ended HEU and plutonium production for weapons, but it is believed that these production areas were stopped in 1987 and 1990, respectively. So their quantity of weapons usable fissile material is not growing. China reported separated civilian plutonium to the IAEA as just over 41 kilograms at the end of 2016, so a very small amount, again, compared to others. They keep stating an intent to construct commercial reprocessing capability, and they're in the process of negotiating with France to purchase a French-designed reprocessing plant. But the previously proposed venue was stopped as a result of local protests. And now that uranium prices are so low, the business case for reprocessing is much less compelling. So China's been kind of dragging its feet for years on signing this contract with France. So they do not reprocess plutonium on a commercial scale, is the bottom line of that point. In principle, if this is sold, France will require that this facility be placed under IAEA safeguards, even though China, as a member of the P5, is not legally bound to have safeguards on all of its facilities. Similarly, commercial enrichment facilities based on a Russian centrifuge technology, which are currently being operated at only a pilot scale, would also fall under IAEA safeguards. And estimates are that China has about 1 ton of civilian highly enriched uranium on top of the HEU it has in its weapons programs. So bottom line, China doesn't have nearly the challenge that other countries, including the United States, have when it comes to protecting weapons usable materials. And during my time in government, I have to say I didn't worry that much about Chinese nuclear security. The main critique until recently was that the Chinese legal basis for nuclear security was out of date. But the passage of China's new atomic energy law in 2017 has remedied most of those concerns about the legal basis. China's also taken a number of international steps to promote nuclear security. They joined the IAEA's Incident and Trafficking Database in 2007. They ratified the Convention on Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials and its 2005 amendment. In 2010, they signed the International Convention for Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terror. They have, over time, been continuous contributors to the IAEA's Voluntary Nuclear Security Fund that funds most of the IAEA's work on nuclear security. They invited an International Physical Protection Advisory Service mission from the IAEA to review one of their facilities. And most famously, in 2016, they established the Center of Excellence in Nuclear Security. Now, these and other steps have led China to be the most improved country in NTI's 2018 Nuclear Security Index, with a ranking of 14 out of 22 countries with fissile material. So that's kind of the baseline of where China is on nuclear security. Pretty darn good in the broad scheme of things. U.S. and China have been working together on nuclear security issues going as far back to 1994, when there was an effort between Los Alamos National Laboratory and China's Academy of Engineering Physics under what was called the Arms Control Technical Exchange Program, which was, I have to assume, getting ready for some of the arms control efforts that Nancy was talking about. And this effort had grown into a lab-to-lab program of cooperation. In other words, U.S. national weapons labs with Chinese weapons labs between 1995 and 1998. And this was inspired largely by the U.S.-Russian model of lab-to-lab cooperation under the Nunn-Lugar program. But in the case of China, it was much less about U.S. assistance. And the U.S.-Chinese cooperation on nuclear security has always been much more of a peer relationship and much less about assistance. And we can talk about more about the implications of that in the Q&A if you like. This lab-to-lab program was designed to help create interest in China of a stronger nuclear security system by demonstrating what the advantages of a modern system would be, including material protection, control, and accounting, and all the associated issues in that respect. But in 1999, the Cox Committee report alleged Chinese espionage at U.S. national laboratories, and the program ended. And since then, there's been the direct nuclear security and control cooperation on China's military materials, military facilities, and nuclear weapons has not even been discussed. But on the civilian side, the cooperation has continued to grow, and exchanges and visits to address a range of nuclear security issues, including nuclear smuggling, detection and forensics, insider threats, have been underway for a while. The U.S. was a major partner in China's Showpiece Center of Excellence for Nuclear Security, which opened in March 2016 and has since provided a location for bilateral technical exchanges, as well as regional and international training. As the minimization of highly enriched uranium became a key aspect of global nuclear security, U.S. and China worked together to develop a low-enriched uranium fuel for China's version of miniature neutron source reactors, or MNSR. After proving the viability of this fuel on its own reactors, China worked with the United States and the IAEA to remove HEU cores from MNSRs that they had exported to Nigeria and Ghana and replace them with LEU cores. And even more recently than that, under the 2005 Iran nuclear deal, U.S. experts had been helping Chinese scientists to reconfigure a heavy water reactor in Iran so that it could not be used as a significant source of plutonium. But that effort has been cut back, of course, with the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA. Now, this cooperative attitude was on full display during China's active participation in the 4 nuclear security summits. President Xi attended all 4 summits, and China's Sherpa delegation was led at the deputy foreign minister level, which was quite high in comparison with other delegations. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they were easy negotiators in the course of negotiating the communiques. They were quite challenging, and I still bear a few scars from the final negotiating moments before the closing of the statement for the 2016 summit, where the Chinese delegation had instructions from Beijing to somehow include in the text a reference to win-win strategies, which is a phrase that President Xi likes to use in a lot of different ways, but he's used it in every nuclear security summit speech that he's made. So this was an important thing to them. It was only with difficulty that we found our way through a linguistic challenge to find phrases that were comfortable for the Chinese, but also sounded more leaderly than win-win strategies did to English-speaking ears. China also made many national commitments at each of the summits, and while they were initially skeptical of the so-called gift baskets, or collective commitments around particular nuclear security topics, in 2016 they joined 4 of these gift baskets, including one of the most meaningful relating to implementation of the IAEA's own nuclear security guidelines. And this move paved the way for others to join what became known as IMCIRC 869 in the IAEA parlance. This came even more to the fore as Russia voiced its determination in 2014 to boycott the final summit. And we were a bit concerned about whether or not any other major countries would follow suit. And Chinese diplomats were, however, very direct in their support for President Obama's summit initiative, telling me not to worry about losing face because of Russia's absence, because China would make sure that the final summit was a success for President Obama. I wouldn't say that we were especially worried about losing face, but we were very grateful for Chinese support, and no other country backed out. Now, when it comes to the U.S.-China nuclear security dialogue with capital letters, it was on the back of these positive engagements that the U.S. and China decided to create this bilateral dialogue during President Xi's state visit in 2015. And I'm sure it also helped that the U.S. had set up similar dialogues with Japan and South Korea. We held the first meeting of the U.S.-China dialogue in Stockholm on the margins of the final Sherpa meeting before the 2016 summit. And the teams were led by, again, the Deputy Foreign Minister on the Chinese side, and on the U.S. side by me in my White House role, and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Elliot Kang. And both sides had extensive interagency participation from their respective diplomatic, energy, regulatory, technical, customs, and law enforcement agencies. We really had to struggle to find a table that was big enough for all of us. The conversation was detailed and wide-ranging, and it proved that we had many topics of shared interest on nuclear security. And subsequent meetings were held in Washington in 2017, in Beijing in 2018, and the fourth meeting will be held here in Washington next week. Now, what I had not realized prior to rejoining NTI in 2018 was that the Chinese Foreign Ministry had asked NTI to partner with the China Arms Control and Disarmament Association, which is a think tank that's associated with the Chinese MFA, to create a Track 2 process that would parallel and support the official dialogue. So as a result, NTI and CACTA have brought together non-government experts to discuss radiological security, transportation security, cybersecurity, and insider threats. Now, these meetings were observed by officials from both governments, and NTI and CACTA report on the official dialogue on their discussions. And it's noteworthy that this dialogue is continuing in the face of the increasingly adversarial relationship between U.S. and China, and in particular given the constraints that the U.S. has recently placed on nuclear energy cooperation with China, which I know Jonas will give some further insights onto. And I certainly hope that both the official and the Track 2 discussions continue, given how much China can contribute to nuclear security internally, regionally, and internationally in light of its own growing nuclear energy program and its aggressive nuclear exports. So what more can China do? In the 2018 NTI Nuclear Security Index, China lost points, or it did not achieve more because of two major reasons. One having to do with the number of sites and movements of fissile material, and the second having to do with the lack of published cybersecurity measures. They also suffered from challenges relating to governance, corruption, including within the nuclear industry, political stability, and the presence of groups such as the East Turkestan Islamic Movement interested in illicitly acquiring fissile materials. And at NTI, we are in the process of gathering data for the 2020 index, and we will see whether China is able to address these concerns and continue its strong upward trajectory in the ratings. Some other steps that China might consider to improve its global and internal standing on nuclear security would be, first of all, to provide the IAEA with the information required in Section 14 of the amended CPP&M, Convention on Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials, that covers the laws and regulations that implement the treaty. This is the one specific requirement on all countries who have ratified that amendment, and the goal would be to have all countries complete that provision of information to the IAEA before the 2021 review conference on that amended treaty. Secondly, China could support strong language in the ministerial statement for the upcoming International Conference on Nuclear Security that the IAEA will host. This is currently the only routine meeting at a high political level on nuclear security, and it's a place where countries can come to both express political support for the IAEA's work on nuclear security, but also to provide information about deliverables and steps that they themselves have taken. And anything that's said in the ICON's meeting, NTI can see and give credit to in our Nuclear Security Index. So that's a little word for everybody who's trying to promote nuclear security in China or elsewhere. China could also be more active in the efforts to make this review conference in 2021 for the amended Convention on Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials, to make that really a meaningful and substantive discussion of nuclear security. There are some voices who are trying to suggest that the meeting could be simply a gavel up, gavel down, checking the box that yes, we had a convention, we had a review conference, the convention is fine, we'll talk at some indefinite point in the future. But there's a lot of opportunities to make that a really meaningful event, and China can participate more in promoting that kind of substantive discussion and then to bring that discussion when they participate in the meeting itself. There are more information circulars that came out of the Nuclear Security Summit process, to which China could identify itself as a supporter or an implementer of those commitments made. And China could also work with governments in Syria, Iran, and Pakistan to convert the miniature neutron source reactors that are there from highly enriched uranium to low enriched uranium, and then to remove that HEU. Those are countries in which the U.S. is not likely to be helpful in carrying out those removals and conversions, but there are certainly capabilities within the IAEA to work with, and Russia in some cases as well, to work with China to effectuate those removals. Now, China has also been participating in activities of the Nuclear Security Contact Group, which was set up after the summits to maintain dialogue among senior officials on how to implement the commitments that came out of the summit process. This group has not been as effective as some had hoped in creating a reliable pro-nuclear security coalition within the IAEA's decision-making bodies, but more could be done in this respect. And China in particular could be helpful, as the nuclear security dialogue in the IAEA often breaks down along north-south lines. Now, China is a member of the non-aligned movement, and they could do more to rally states within the NAM to support nuclear security measures and to prevent bloc politics from stymieing progress on nuclear security in the IAEA and other venues. So in conclusion, I hope that the US and China, separately and together, can continue to find ways to cooperate on nuclear security. Rather than a zero-sum game, nuclear security can in fact be a win-win proposition. When it comes to nuclear terrorism, we all lose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our last speaker will be John Siegel, who is the Associate Director of the Center for International and Security Studies at Maryland. He leads research initiatives there related to the center's Nuclear Past, Present, and Future project, which encompasses evaluating the impact of nuclear energy trends on nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear security in East Asia, strengthening global nuclear governance systems, analyzing the nuclear proliferation implications of advanced nuclear energy developments, nuclear materials transparency, and the requirements for a comprehensive global nuclear materials accounting system. He also leads the center's efforts to reach out to policymakers, expert communities, and the public, and we benefited from some of this, sharing some of these outreach. And in an earlier stage, he was the editor of the Bulletin of Atomic Sciences, one of the pioneer journals in our field. So please, go ahead.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you for Hudson for hosting us today, and for my colleagues for speaking so eloquently prior to now. From the first two talks, you heard a relatively positive story about U.S.-Chinese nuclear cooperation in both the arms control and nuclear security fields, or at least a lot of room for positive growth and opportunities for substantive cooperation. The same can be roughly said about U.S.-Chinese nuclear energy cooperation until relatively recently. What I'm going to try to do in the remaining moments of my time here is to talk about the rapid decline of U.S.-Chinese civilian nuclear cooperation over the last several years, and to examine how this decline is likely to have repercussions for both U.S. For the United States and China, in particular for U.S. nuclear research and development and commercial suppliers, and most importantly, perhaps, is the impact it will have on U.S. non-proliferation policy. So I'm going to take a step back in history a little bit, as our previous two speakers have done, and talk a little bit about the way that U.S.-Chinese nuclear energy cooperation began and the success that it achieved early in this century. After U.S. and Chinese cooperation began in the 1980s, there was a lot of positive movement and a lot of desire among the Chinese officials and Chinese technologists to gain access to American technology, American research and development capabilities. But a lot of this early work didn't really come to fruition for a variety of factors. U.S.-Chinese authorities initially signed a peaceful uses of nuclear technology, a so-called PUNT agreement, in 1998, finally. And cooperation under this agreement began in earnest, really, with the first meeting of the PUNT Joint Coordinating Committee in 2002, right? So at the beginning of the Bush administration. Soon thereafter, with U.S. support and with the promise of U.S. commercial nuclear exports, China joined the Nuclear Suppliers Group. And then a few years after that, China signed an agreement to buy 4 Westinghouse AP1000 reactors and to have the reactor technology transferred to Chinese suppliers. Additional reactors sales were expected to follow. So this was the kind of the fruition of really 2 decades worth of negotiations and a desire among Chinese officials and technologists to gain access to U.S. nuclear technologies. The same year, in 2006, Chinese officials joined the Generation 4 International Forum and several reactor working groups within the forum, right, including the high-temperature gas-cooled reactor group, where the United States was in the lead and the most active. For those of you who aren't familiar with the GIF, it's an important multilateral forum for countries where the countries have kind of divvied up responsibility for investigating specific advanced reactor technologies. In September 2007, again, at the initiative of the Bush administration, U.S. and Chinese officials agreed to a plan of action for broader bilateral cooperation on advanced nuclear fuel cycle initiatives. This all is part of U.S. effort to gain support for the Global Nuclear Energy Partnership, so-called GNEP. Right? This cooperation, this ramp up of nuclear energy civilian cooperation continued into the Obama administration. In late 2011, U.S. and Chinese officials signed a Nuclear Energy Science and Technology Agreement, a so-called NEST agreement. Lots of very catchy acronyms. That was subsumed under the PUNT agreement and built on the Science Protocol agreement signed earlier in the year. Very consequentially, as a consequence of this NEST agreement, a cooperative research and development agreement was signed between Oak Ridge National Laboratory, one of the lead national laboratories in the United States on nuclear energy development, and the Chinese Academy of Sciences, with China funding up to $5 million in nuclear energy research at Oak Ridge for up to 10 years. Another point that a lot of Americans, and particularly younger Americans, are not familiar with, the notion that China was funding nuclear energy research in the United States. In total, throughout this period, Chinese and U.S. entities were cooperating on nuclear energy-related research at multiple locations within the United States and within China on projects as varied as the development of molten salt and high-temperature gas-cooled reactors, the deployment of neutrino detection technology, the safety and security development at reactor and fuel cycle facilities, the development of hybrid generation capacities at nuclear facilities, again, advanced fuel cycle development, and more. U.S. exports during this period, commercial exports of nuclear technologies and materials to China, rose from an average of $7 million per year, according to Comtrade data, during the aughts, to a peak of $305 million in 2015. Now, this growth is primarily a consequence of the AP1000 deals, but it is noteworthy and remarkable nonetheless. Perhaps most importantly during this period, there were regular meetings, annual meetings and interactions of Chinese officials and scientists under both the PUNT and the NEST agreements, within which US non-proliferation, security, and safety concerns were prioritized. Starting in 2017, however, this run of relatively robust cooperation began to unravel. Upon taking office, the Trump administration began an interagency review of US-Chinese civilian nuclear cooperation. After cost overruns and delays in delivering the first AP-1000 units in China, Chinese frustrations led many observers to question whether additional AP-1000 units beyond the initial 4 and any other US-supplied nuclear reactors would ever be built in China. Contributing to this shift were the structural changes in the domestic Chinese nuclear industry consolidation that also made the purchase of additional US nuclear reactors less likely. The biggest setback, however, in US commercial exports came when the US policy review led to the curtailment of US technology transfers and the licensing of nuclear exports to China in October 2018. Although the new policy ostensibly didn't affect licenses approved prior to January 18, or technology transfers already agreed to, this new policy had a chilling effect on commercial cooperation between the two countries. The 2018 policy change also halted technology transfers on non-LWR, non-light water reactor technologies, including those that were ongoing underneath the Gen 4 Forum and the NEST agreements that were previously mentioned. So this effectively ended research and development cooperation under the NEST agreement and halted collaboration between American and Chinese scientists and engineers at Oak Ridge and Idaho National Laboratories. Among the limited joint activity that continues under the US-China PUNT agreement, the most prominent is the sporadic work to secure radioactive source materials that Laura spoke about a few minutes ago, both with China and elsewhere in the world. There have been no bilateral NEST and PUNT committee meetings since 2017, meetings that had been conducted, as I mentioned earlier, on average annually. Perhaps most importantly, US officials began taking an adversarial and aggressive approach to the Chinese nuclear industry and research community in general. On this very stage, several months ago, US officials labeled the Chinese government predatory revisionists because of its efforts in support of Chinese commercial nuclear exports. US officials also became vocally critical of effects of Chinese exports on non-proliferation, despite Chinese commitments to the same NXG export guidelines and the improvement of the Chinese nuclear export system that the United States subscribes to. Now, the administration's approach is intended to protect against the national security risks of unauthorized Chinese transfers of technologies and in order to level the playing field for US nuclear suppliers. But its narrow, blunt force approach in doing so is likely to have unintended consequences, and we're already beginning to see the fruit of those. So the history of US nuclear cooperation suggests that positive cooperative relationships, where US officials and scientists cooperate on shared research agendas with partners, engage in regular cooperative substantive activities, and support and encourage the supply and transfer of nuclear technologies and materials, have afforded the United States significant leverage on issues of non-proliferation, safety, security, and technology development. This type of leverage is likely to be particularly important as China increases its civilian nuclear exports, expands its already large research and development enterprise, deploys an advanced nuclear reactor fleet, and becomes a training ground for other countries' nuclear regulators, security experts, et cetera. There's no certainty that Chinese export controls, material security commitments, or safety standards will be implemented fully under these circumstances. However, US officials would be in a much better position to work with Chinese scientists and officials to support the safe and secure expansion of commercial nuclear power in China, Central Asia, Africa, North Asia, if the two had a functioning cooperative relationship in which US and Chinese officials and scientists could regularly exchange expertise, and in which US nuclear companies had reliable supply relationships with the Chinese nuclear enterprise. Okay. The US alone obviously cannot manifest these circumstances. It requires Chinese cooperation and commitment. But current US nuclear energy policies have only contributed to the deterioration of the broader civilian nuclear energy cooperative relationship. rather than suggest that investment in U.S. domestic nuclear development and capacity alone can ensure the adoption of U.S. non-proliferation, security, and safety standards globally, U.S. policymakers ought to invest in the type of cooperative research and development and commercial cooperation that have benefited U.S. objectives in the past, as of recently as a couple years ago. The vehicles of the renewed cooperation agreement that was signed between the United States and China and the punt and nest agreements are sufficient basis for this type of cooperation. The expanding nuclear energy research and development capacities within the U.S. national lab systems and American companies present additional opportunities for U.S.-Chinese nuclear energy cooperation to be renewed. Both Chinese and American efforts to develop innovative nuclear technologies have something to gain in the process. What's missing, however, is a genuine prioritization within the United States of non-proliferation, nuclear security, and safety objectives in U.S. relations with China. Because if this were to be pursued, the types of technical and commercial cooperation that would follow as a consequence would achieve many of those same objectives. So, thank you very much for your time, and I'll hand it back over to Richard to lead off the question and answer period.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm just going to make one short question to each panelist, and then I'm eager to transition to the audience. I see many experts on China and nuclear issues. For Nancy, whatever the status of the past limits you described in the Chinese nuclear force, it's not clear to me how long those will persist. I mean, if you're looking at what we saw on display just recently in the parade in Beijing, the estimates in the U.S. government, even the Russians who I talked to think that the Chinese are really no longer satisfied with just a minimum deterrent. They're going to give themselves additional warheads, and some of the Russians thought that they were going to try and in the next decade approach the kind of diversity of delivery systems and the number of warheads as the U.S. has and Russia has, and only then maybe participate in the traditional conception of arms control, which I still tend to view things and I wouldn't exclude the benefits of doing the alternative approaches the Chinese are interested in. What do you think is going to happen with this in terms of the projection of the forces? Do you agree that, I mean, how would you estimate them?
You know, the United States and Russia have been predicting that as China becomes wealthier and technologically more advanced, that it will, try to basically match the United States and Russia. And they just assume that it's been lack of money and lack of technical expertise that have held China back. And that's part of why I think that, the idea that China really does think about nuclear weapons and deterrence differently is important, right? And that if that desire to have a minimum deterrent and to have a no first use policy because it's consistent with the minimum deterrent and reduces nuclear risks has been a consistent part of Chinese thinking so far. And I don't see anything at the official level that suggests that the Chinese government has called that into question. I think that there's been a traditional desire on China's part to not be surprised by technological advances that other countries have made and to experiment with different capabilities that the United States or Russia already have so that China understands them and knows what they can and can't do and could replicate them if they needed to. But there have been consistent projections about how rapidly China is going to change their nuclear posture that have always overshot the mark. So, I would expect to see slow growth in capabilities, more focus on technological exploration than actually building up large numbers, and much more of China's military modernization focused on its conventional capabilities than its nuclear capabilities.
Thank you. For Laura, I remember that when we set up the Center for Nuclear Excellence, there was the thinking that China would be in a really good position to work with some governments on nuclear security that were going to be difficult for the U.S. Has that been realized, and is there perhaps more we could do in that area?
Well, there's more China can do in that area. I'm not sure that there's much the U.S. needs to do to encourage that. It's It's quite an amazing center. I've never seen anything quite like it. It's extremely well equipped. It's large. It has dormitories that allow international or people to come, visitors to come and spend time there. They have mock-ups of almost any aspect of the nuclear fuel cycle that you might need, including significant nuclear forensics capacity there. So it's a really rich and capable training facility. And they do a lot of regional training. There is at least a nominal effort among the 3 Asian centers of excellence, which were some of the earliest ones and the most capable ones, Japan, South Korea, and China, to cooperate and sequence the training that they do. They all host IAEA-led training efforts, but they also generate their own. And so I do think that it's a logical extension of their nuclear energy exports, that they would use that center as a place to train their clients who are going to be receiving these exports in nuclear security, and to also promulgate the regulatory transfer of knowledge that would be appropriate for that. And so I think it will remain to be seen, but they certainly have an ambition to have it be a very large, a very, very capable center. And I think it can be used much more than it is right now for that purpose.
And then, Jonas, what you described seems to be a pattern we're seeing in many areas between China and the U.S., that there are a lot of the current administration's broadly supported by members of Congress and industry trying to restructure the China-U.S. economic relationship to remove some difficulties. And I'm wondering if you thought, why you would think that the nuclear sector, nuclear energy sector, that is, would be any different from what's happening overall pattern with the relationship.
So, I mean, one reason why I think that there's a lot of opportunity in that particular area is because of Chinese growth in nuclear generation domestically and in its projected exports internationally. We've done some modeling at the center, and although China is unlikely to meet its largest and most kind of aggressive nuclear energy growth targets domestically, it is continuing to grow faster and deploy more reactors around the world, particularly in China, than any other country. And so this is a really, real fertile ground for U.S. companies and individuals in the government, which has a lot of research and development and history and IP, frankly, that can be very useful to Chinese markets and to Chinese reactor suppliers. And so I think there's just it's a really fertile ground. I think a lot of opportunity for both the Chinese and the Americans to take advantage of this.
Okay, thank you. So if people wish to ask a question or make a comment, just please raise your hand as we begin here.
Hi, I'm Robin Walker with Lockheed Martin. I have a question about U.S. deterrence policy as it relates to proliferation here. The current administration seems to have some doubts about the security umbrella that it provides to much of the world. So if that continues to crumble, especially in East Asia, and technologically advanced countries like Japan or South Korea or Singapore or Australia start to feel that they're no longer protected by the U.S. nuclear umbrella and want to at least take steps toward developing their own nuclear weapons programs, how would China react to that? Would they be on the same side as us? Would they work with us in terms of non-proliferation efforts? Would they advance their own nuclear programs? What are your best guesses on that? Thanks.
To start off, I would say, I think the idea that the U.S. nuclear umbrella is crumbling and that allies, particularly Japan and South Korea, are likely to consider developing their own nuclear weapons in response is overblown, right, to begin with. But it is a concern that China has, right? That things could lead to that, and I think that China would very actively be working with the United States to try to persuade Japan and South Korea not to do that. I mean, I think that's one of the many reasons why China has been as active as it has been
on North Korean nuclear proliferation. It doesn't want to see anything going on in the region that could either stimulate proliferation or be a reason for US military action in the region. I think China is also intensely concerned about missile defense in the region, and that's been the other thing that the United States has used to try to reassure allies. So, when the United States either talks about developing and employing new types of nuclear weapons or increasing its missile defense commitments in the region to try to reassure the allies, it's doing something that I think is not actually necessary. I think it'd be far better to just make it really clear we were committed to the alliance and not talk about possibly it's not valuable to us, right? And it has a really negative effect on our ability to cooperate with China on some other things that we'd like to cooperate on.
Yeah, I would just add, I found both the Russians and the Chinese much less acceptant of the argument in the past that U.S. extended deterrence guarantees serve a non-proliferation function. I think they've become much less enthusiastic about the U.S. role in South Korea and Japan in terms of the nuclear dimension of the alliance because of some of the reasons we discussed. So why don't we go ahead? It's easier logistically if we just move from one part of the room and then we'll sweep backwards.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. I'm Jennifer Mackbee, Federation of American Scientists. Panelists were terrific. I just wanted to ask Nancy, the mention that China was not interested in arms control. I think specifically regarding INF and START, they've always said that until other countries, the two big powers, come down to their levels, they would not negotiate. But that's yet to be tested whether or not they would actually join at that point. But also on the CTBT, they have said, Shah Zhu Khan and others have said that they would ratify when the US does. Just an added little note. And Laura, I was just curious, I'm interested to learn more about NTI-CACTA cooperation since I was just there, but why did China then withdraw from your IPNDV verification work?
The Chinese withdrawal came right after Russia's withdrawal, and so I think my colleagues who lead the IPNDV work, which is not me, were of course sorry to see both of them go, and we're working to encourage them both to come back. But I think it may have been just a recent manifestation of what we see a lot of times of China following the lead of one or the other powers between the U.S. and Russia. They claimed to share the Russian concern that they didn't understand how it was possible to have conversations about warhead dismantlement with non-weapon states in a way that did not transfer sensitive information. I mean, so essentially they weren't behind the whole premise of IPNDV. The whole point of IPNDV is to discuss how you might do that. And of course, NTI has zero interest in being part of, and it would be illegal for us as an NGO to be part of any discussions that would end up, transferring weapons design information to countries that weren't authorized to have it. So I'm not aware that there was a specific concern raised beyond an echo of the Russian concern about that.
Jennifer, if I could just ask you, because I know you were just there at the CACTA conference. Did anything come out of that you wouldn't want to share with the group?
Sorry, I don't think specifically that relates to this conference. Probably not, no. Thanks.
Then go ahead, Miles, the person in the back, Miles in the back. And then we'll move forward.
Miles Pomper from the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. I have a question and a comment. First of all, for Laura, you mentioned the MNSRs and possibility of particularly Pakistan, Iran, and Syria conversions. My understanding, and you may have this as well, is that the Pakistanis are on board about the conversion, and we're basically waiting for the Chinese to come forward with the money for the conversion. Do you have any idea what the holdup is? And Jonas, I have to say, in terms of the comment, I frankly disagree with a lot of your analysis about the Chinese nuclear industry and U.S.-China nuclear cooperation. for one thing, the China market is not what it was 2 or 3 years ago. There was a lot of cooperation back then. The Chinese were building a lot of reactors. There's been very little new construction in the last 2 or 3 years. These are the reactors that are being completed now were started some time ago, obviously. The Chinese have also, you alluded to it a little bit, but they've decided for their own reasons to take much more of a national champion approach to the nuclear industry and push their own nuclear industry rather than importing U.S. technology. And I think that's about nationalism and other factors in the government there. And you also didn't seem to really recognize that the role of industrial and state-sponsored espionage in terms of stealing U.S. secrets that would be helpful in quieting Chinese nuclear submarines, which was this was not sort of a decision out of nowhere by the administration. There were real security concerns involved.
So Miles, I'm not familiar with the status of funding for the Pakistan thing, but the point I raised those 3 countries as things that China should do to advance the work that they've already begun so successfully in Nigeria and Ghana.
And I'll just say, Miles, and thank you for your comments. I think there was a pause in new construction, commercial construction in China. That pause has been lifted now. There's new orders coming in of plants. And again, I mentioned that the national kind of objectives or goals have been routinely kind of expanding and collapsing, but there are still the goals for domestic deployment are still higher than the current capacity or those under construction. And so the government believes there's going to be additional builds within China, and likely some even in inland provinces, which is kind of the largest goal that's part of the development plan. As far as your last comment regarding the reasons for the change in U.S. policy in 2018, I thought I acknowledged them fully in talking about the national security risks associated with the unauthorized transfer of these technologies. I'm not endorsing that call, but at the same time, I think the way that the administration has responded, again, has been kind of a very blanket kind of, none of this can be good for anything. And I think that's the wrong approach to take. I think you can be protecting U.S. national security interests, the interests of commercial operators and commercial suppliers in the United States, and engage in cooperation, commercial cooperation, research and development cooperation, regulatory, security cooperation, et cetera. So that's the response to that.
Okay, Greg? First Greg and then the person.
Greg Thielman, board member of the Arms Control Association. In the U.S., there has been a lot of discussion in a nuclear non-proliferation context about the U.S. Navy's use of highly enriched uranium in its submarines, which is basically at a fissile material level, which is not a good role model for the world. As I understand it, the Chinese have a much lower level of enriched uranium in their nuclear-powered submarines. So my question is, have the Chinese ever been critical of the U.S. policy here in light of their own less vulnerable position? And is this a subject of possible discussion between the 2 countries?
I don't know that there's been any discussion between the 2. If it were, it would be more likely to be happening in the strategic stability conversations that Nancy mentioned, which are not happening. But I cannot, under any circumstances, imagine the U.S. Navy cooperating with anybody about submarine technology, least of all U.S. submarine fuel approaches.
Wait for the mic.
Yeah, excuse me, Bernie Cooney. I'm a national security consultant and a former B-52 SAC crew member who, when the USS Pueblo was captured by the North Koreans back in '68, we were put on, of course, nuclear alert to get ready to go into North Korea. And I know Nancy mentioned efforts that were being made, it doesn't seem like China has really stepped up with respect to North Korea in terms of here they are, their neighbor, who apparently assists in the economic development of North Korea. What are they doing about nuclear non-proliferation? When are they gonna step up to the crisis du jour, North Korea?
There certainly is a widespread perception in the United States that China hasn't stepped up. And I would say it hasn't done as much as we wish China would, but it's done more than it gets credit for. And in particular, it substantially tightened its enforcement of UN sanctions against North Korea early in the Trump administration. The Trump administration then basically turned around and initiated its trade war against China, which isn't a great way to thank somebody for stepping up and helping you out. But I do think that this is part of what I was trying to say before with China's approach to non-proliferation, is that it believes in using a mix of carrots and sticks, not just sticks, which is the current Trump administration approach. And I think that it was hopeful that if it joined with the United States and other countries in terms of tightening the sanctions, that you would see the steps that North Korea has taken, i.e. the moratorium on nuclear testing, the moratorium on testing long-range missiles, but then both North Korea and China expected to see at least partial sanctions relief from the United States in response to that, and that hasn't happened. So I think that that's kind of where we're stuck, right? Is that China thinks that the United States ought to be more flexible. The United States wants China to do even more than it's already doing on the sanctions front, and the whole situation is stalemated.
I'll add a couple points on that. I do think that historically China can and should be doing more on sanctions enforcement, and there had been a fair amount of activity in support of training and improving, their bureaucratic ability to do that. That doesn't affect the willpower at the top, and I do think that China benefits at least somewhat and knows that they benefit from the U.S. constantly being on edge with North Korea. So I think there's a tolerance that China has had for North Korea's nuclear adventurism that, as a challenge for the U.S. I think North Korea has gone beyond what China feels is valuable by severely upsetting the balance in the region, but the other thing is that China lives in desperate fear of a collapse of the North Korean regime and the population flows that would then come into China. And so they're a little bit, I do think that Nancy's point is correct, that China's ability to influence North Korea is somewhat overblown. I will say that NTI my colleagues recently did a really excellent piece of work looking at if there were to be some understanding reached on eliminating some or all of North Korea's nuclear arsenal, that what role a Nunn-Lugar type cooperative approach could be to eliminating those capacities. And one of the key arguments in that report is that it will need to be a multilateral effort from the get-go, and that at a minimum the countries who are involved in the six-party talks have important roles to play in making sure that any denuclearization agreement that's reached by North Korea is implemented in a cooperative and peaceful way. And I think China has an enormous role to play in that respect. And NTI has been briefing China on that report in hopes that they can kind of given what Nancy said about the kind of slow pace of decision making, that when the time comes that China's asked to step up in implementing that kind of an approach, that China will have made the decision that they both have a lot to bring and a lot to gain from a cooperative approach in that region.
Just to keep things lively, I'm going to push back a little bit on your idea that China thinks that North Korea's nuclear adventurism is useful because it keeps the United States off balance. Because to the extent that North Korea's nuclear adventurism is the most commonly cited reason the United States gives for developing its missile defense capabilities, and that's something that China really does not want to see happen, I would be extremely surprised if China thinks that on balance, even a low level of nuclear adventurism by North Korea is a net positive for its security.
It's a fair point.
Okay. Next set of questions, comments, or we can go back to the side then.
Hi, I'm Stella from Wisconsin Project on Nuclear Arms Control. I just have a bit of broad question. I'm curious about whether domestic circumstances like human rights issues or political unrest will affect U.S. nuclear policy towards China.
Would or should is good. What do you? Go ahead. Anyone want to come in on that one?
Well, I will say it has not been a major consideration for this administration in general. So, I would say probably not. It has enough other things driving its policy vis-a-vis China. Jonas, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the work that you've done on public opinion in China towards nuclear policy?
Sure. I think there is a growing awareness among the Chinese government that how the public thinks about nuclear energy development in this case is actually important and is actually worth considering in some form. The focus on social stability and measuring social stability and trying to assess the impact on social stability of technological developments, particularly infrastructure developments like nuclear energy, is a growing aim of the Chinese government and the Chinese development authorities. And so, to the degree that intersects with human rights concerns, I think that can be a useful thing.
I'll just say from the point of view of the NTI index, those will be included in the judgments about governance and political stability. And so it's possible that those could could go down in China's rating.
Yeah, it's a great question though, because it's not, it's getting harder and harder to compartmentalize. You used to be able to say both Russia and China, well, okay, we can disagree in these areas, but we can cooperate in others, and it's become much more difficult to do that now. Next question.
Hi, Stephen Young with the Union of Concerned Scientists. I think it was mentioned before, but just following up on the U.S. offer or preference for reaching an agreement with Russia and China to sort of replace New START or somehow follow on to New START. In the context of the U.S. considering extending New START, many of us in the community unfortunately felt that that offer that seems not insane but difficult was actually a stalking horse and an excuse to withdraw from New START when it didn't work. Is that a view the panelists share, or what's your take on this issue of where things are going in New START?
Yes, I would say that that's a view that this analyst definitely shares, that, by saying that there's no point in, continuing an agreement that the United States already has with Russia or extending New START unless not only China joins, but you also include a variety of other both nuclear and non-nuclear capabilities. You, in effect, are going back to the U.S. position in the 1950s of saying you can't have any arms control with anybody unless you have a comprehensive agreement with everybody. And usually when the United States says that, it's a thinly veiled way of saying we don't actually want any kind of agreements. So, I think as long as there's such a large difference between the nuclear capabilities that the United States and Russia has and what China has, there's absolutely no reason why the United States and Russia shouldn't go ahead and extend New START, shouldn't look at negotiating a follow-on agreement that further reduces their nuclear capabilities. China they actually haven't said you have to come all the way down to our level, but they've talked about wanting to see substantial further progress between the United States and Russia before they would engage, without being specific about exactly when. And I think that it would be reasonable at some point to expect China to join into those conversations, but there has to be some attention to what their security concerns are too. And as long as the United States is taking the position that we want, Russia, for example, to not only reduce their strategic weapons, but also make disproportionate cuts in their tactical nuclear weapons, and at the same time, we're not willing to talk about any constraints on missile defense, it's going to be very difficult to get Russia or China to agree to negotiations that deal with U.S. concerns and explicitly leave their concerns off the table.
Can I ask a question regarding that? To Jonas or Nancy, because you've been working at this China arms control issue longer than I have. There was always this kind of theory that the U.S. and Russia, U.S. Soviet Union, had built up this lore, this knowledge, this reflex of how to do arms control, a vocabulary and so on. We saw the Chinese beginning to take on that vocabulary issue with a glossary that was produced in the P5 context. And I know there's been any number of Track 2 efforts to try to make sure that the Chinese are, ready to join a multilateral strategic arms control effort. I'd be interested in your thoughts on whether that has been effective, whether it was the right question in the first place, or, what is there separately from the national interest? Is there a capacity, or would there be a capacity issue in the future?
There was a major effort made in China during the 1990s to develop capacity, both technical and diplomatic, around the CTBT negotiations, right? And a lot of the people who are the leaders in China now on arms control-related issues are people who came of age at that point in time. So I think that that's what's really important in terms of building capacity in China and in the United States, is that we keep actively working on these issues, right? And we keep saying to young people, there's a future for you in this. It's worth investing your time in learning. I would say that the glossary project, on one hand, has useful. The fact that it's a Chinese initiative, I think, is useful. But it acts as if it's just a straight translation problem, where it really is much more about these fundamental differences in how the countries think about security, how they think about international relations, how they think about power. And having those kinds of discussions, I think, are much more important and more informative than just a straight translation exercise. And the United States doesn't have to think about nuclear deterrence the same way the Chinese do. But I think that if it wants to have a meaningful discussion with them, they have to at least be willing to take seriously the fact that the Chinese take seriously their own approach to nuclear deterrence.
Just to close the loop, I would actually disagree on the issue about the need to include China. I think we do. I would still go over New START renewal, but I think beyond that, I just can't see the U.S. Senate adopting further strategic arms control treaties unless China's involved in some way. It doesn't need to be a co-party with the U.S. and Russia, because there's various. I can't see them Chinese signing on to something that when they're not, they're formalized inequality, and clearly we're not going to go down to the Chinese level soon. But I think there's got to be some way of getting the Chinese more involved. For many people, let me put it this way, for some analysts in the think tank community and in Congress, China's seen as the main long-term threat to the United States, not Russia. So it just doesn't make sense to focus arms control only in Russia. There are these projections, which I know you disputed, but that China has potential to significantly increase its military force over the long term, and even in the nuclear realm. We've already seen the INF Treaty collapse partly due to challenge of China. So I think we have to figure out a way of getting China involved in future arms control. Maybe not as a co-signer, maybe they can do other things they can do. Maybe we can reach out and deal with the Chinese and their agenda. But I think that this problem of not just arms control's got to go beyond, nuclear arms control's got to go beyond Russia and the U.S. is going to persist, even if we can renew START 2.
It would certainly make things easier from a domestic political standpoint if China would join. On the other hand, from the Chinese perspective, right? It's a chicken and egg problem. And for us to say to China, you need to be more involved in nuclear negotiations so that we can get the Senate to ratify future treaties, the Chinese are going to come back to say, well, but we were heavily involved in the CTP2 negotiations, and we made all of the concessions that the United States asked for, and the Senate didn't ratify the agreement. So basically, before you tell us to make more changes to our policy and posture in order to make it easier for you to get the Senate to say yes to something, you work on that problem directly.
I think there was also a question over here, but we'll go ahead with you first.
Is the China no first use policy, have they extended that to include Taiwan? In other words, there's a huge, massive buildup that's gone to the conventional buildup surrounding Formosa. And a lot of people say they've already invaded with the cybersecurity and the threats and the surveillance and everything else. But there's a huge, massive conventional buildup underway today in China and on the coastal, particularly in the coastal areas, to threaten Formosa. Now you were kind of bragging about their no first use, that they throw that out there, and then have they explicitly stated that that wouldn't apply to a conflict with Taiwan?
No, their no first use doctrine is an unconditional no first use doctrine. And personally, I would be particularly surprised if China would think that using nuclear weapons first against Taiwan was somehow in their security interest, because as far as they're concerned, Taiwan is part of China, right? So why would they use nuclear weapons against part of their own territory? I just can't begin to see how they would think that that would advance their security objectives.
I think you meant it in the context if there was a conflict between Taiwan and the mainland, and then the U.S. intervened, maybe using bases from Japan. Would the Chinese consider threatening, a nuclear retaliation to maybe get the Japanese and South Koreans back away from supporting the U.S. intervention?
There's nothing in Chinese military doctrine that suggests they would.
Okay. Did you have a? Go ahead.
Jerome Meyer from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. Turning back to the question of Chinese participation in future arms control agreements and New START. Question for anyone up there, is China more likely to participate in discussions with while the United States and Russia are in a nuclear arms agreement, or outside of a nuclear arms agreement? In other words, with U.S. and Russia constrained on numbers, is there any rationale for them to change the dynamic of the status quo that they enjoy right now?
I would say that China is much more likely to participate if the United States and Russia are still bound and are proceeding in the direction that China would like to see them proceed in. If you remember, that was a major incentive for China to take the NPT, to join the NPT, to participate in the CTBT negotiations, because it saw the United States and the Soviet Union agreeing to arms control, right? And so if the United States and Russia maintain the agreements that they have and are on a downward trajectory again, then I think China will be more likely to participate in future negotiations, partly because they will once again be hopeful that the role of nuclear weapons in international security is decreasing, but also because international pressure on China will go up. Right now, China does come across as the most restrained, most responsible nuclear power without doing anything more than it's already doing, because the United States and Russia are backing away from their existing commitments. If that momentum was changed, then it would be much easier for the international community to turn to China and say, okay, now it's time for you to participate too.
I might say that faced with an unconstrained arms race with no nuclear arms control between Russia and the U.S., which is might happen in the future, that might also provide them with an incentive to reassess their policies, as they've done in other areas, aircraft carriers, bases. So, the Xi administration seems to be push a lot of what we studied in the past. And I think you have a great paper reviewing their previous policy. I think that a lot of those barriers are falling away and things are changing.
It's easy to speculate about what might happen in the future, right? Mm-hmm. But I can speculate the exact opposite as well. So I think that it's better to stay focused on, well, what has happened so far, and what are the Chinese saying? What are they doing now? And in that regard, I think that if they see nuclear threats going down, not up, that they're much more likely to want to participate in the future.
I think, and then you, and then Peter next.
Thank you. Dr. Han from Radio Free Asia. With regards to North Korea and China, and since the nuclear talks have begun between U.S. and North Korea, China, I would say, has been kind of observing from the side on what's actually going on between the U.S. and North Korea. But so far, there has not been any visible progress on working level negotiations since the Stockholm working level negotiation about a month ago. And North Korea said that they'll find a new way if they don't reach a solution by the end of this year. And starting next year, where would you say you see China's role in this nuclear negotiation with North Korea, going forward, if China chooses to lean towards Russia or China, if leaving the U.S. behind? And would you say that China may be willing to be more directly engaged in the negotiation on denuclearization, starting next year? What's your prospect going forward?
I think that it's very, again, having just said I don't like to speculate, right? I don't really want to speculate. If the U.S., and I don't even know if they should be called negotiations, but sort of this U.S. process with North Korea falls apart, my guess is that China would wait and see what happens with the U.S. elections and what happens with the next administration and what its attitude is toward nuclear negotiations with North Korea before deciding what it wanted to do. I would be very surprised if it would sort of leap into the breach in an election year in the United States unless something happens that dramatically alters China's security calculus. If we get back in a situation where Trump is threatening fire and fury and it looks like we're conceivably moving towards a war, then we'd have to see what China did, right? But the thing that it's most likely to do is going to be to try to figure out what leverage does it actually have over North Korea. And the leverage that it has would be, I would say, more in terms of loosening trade restrictions than tightening them even further.
You want to get the final word?
Thank you, Richard. My question is to the young person from the University of Maryland. Is China recently, the foreign ministry spokesman said that if there was a conflict over Taiwan, they reserved the right to use nuclear weapons first against an interfering power, as they put it. So your comment that the Chinese blanketly have no policy to use nuclear weapons first is false. Second is, have you read Tom Reed's book, The Nuclear Express? I urge you to do that, because if that qualifies as China being the most responsible of all the declared nuclear powers, as the #1 proliferator of nuclear weapons technology, I don't see how you get there, given what Tom Reed laid out in all the things from the Con Network to all the other nations that were trying to get nuclear weapons and China's role, including North Korea, how you can say that's responsible, given their responsibilities under the NPT, among other things.
You can answer that, and then if you had any final comments you want to make, and then we'll close. Do you want Nancy, go ahead. And
I think I'm just going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Laura?
Well, I am looking forward to having a chance next week to brief the nuclear security dialogue on the NTI CACTA event that we held last year, and to get our marching orders and our direction for how we use the Track 2 dialogue going forward.
I would just say, I mean, kind of on behalf of all of us, these issues are not going away. None of them are, and we'll need to continue to come up with creative solutions, I think, and not just kind of default to competitive logics that seem to promise less and less as the days pass. So.
Great segue to encourage you to keep coming to our events, but for now, please join me in thanking our speakers.